Yo guys, Punkrat, another video. So many guilds have blasted through Molten Core at this point, and one thing that I've been hearing, and honestly I expected to hear as a reaction from the player base at large, is, well, Molten Core is quite easy. Vanilla content is a joke, you know, these bosses have no mechanics, the whole 9 yards. It was to be expected. Well, what I have to say in response to this is that notion is about to change, at least a little bit. In the next raid tiers, bosses won't be as complicated as some of the more modern raid boss encounters that some of you guys have become accustomed to in retail, but they definitely get a lot more complex, especially headed into AQ40 and naxx. Now, some of you guys might be aware of the fact that certain bosses back in 2006 Vanilla and even 2007 Burning Crusade took near eternities to down, at least to get the world first after they had been released to the player base, so being released with months without ever being cleared. This is definitely true. People seriously struggled with content back then, so much so that there were certain bosses that were absolute stonewalls for certain guilds, causing them to be stuck progressing one specific boss for months, and sometimes leading to the destruction of many raid teams. So that's the topic of this video, raid boss encounters that killed World of Warcraft guilds. Let's get into it. Okay, so this has to be the first one on the list because really it's the first boss that ever stonewalled a guild to begin with. For the most part, Molten Core was a cakewalk. I mean, there was a bit of issues with Ragnaros, but a lot of that was due to some weird tuning and obviously the inexperience of the player base back then and the lack of gear. And the 1.12 experience of the first patch that you're having right now is way different from the game back then on its first couple patches. There was some big updates to itemization, and in general, the game has just changed so much throughout the patches, talents and whatnot. So there's not really much of a stonewall raid boss in Molten Core, but in the next raid tier, we have Blackwing Lair. And here is where I'm telling you from a personal experience, guilds were decimated by one specific boss in this raid. The name of that boss is called Vaelstrasz the Corrupt, who's the second encounter within the raid itself. So after Razorgore, you get through that first room. The second room is Vaelstrasz the Corrupt. It's a slumbering dragon who you talk to, and then it starts a raid encounter after about 30 seconds of RP dialogue. All in all, it's not a super complicated fight, so you might question, how did people get stuck on it? So there wasn't really many mechanics. When you start the encounter, the boss rises up at 30% HP, and all you really have to do is just kill it fast enough before too many people die from the bomb effect. So essentially he's going to put a spell called Burning Adrenaline on one person at a time, and that person gets instant cast abilities so they can just spam heals out or spam frostbolts out, and then after I think about 10 or 15 seconds they blow up, so they just have to run away from the raid, kind of like Living Bomb. You also have infinite mana and infinite resources like energy and rage within this encounter. The whole point is to just go all out and do it as fast as possible. Nowadays people have all of the pre-raid gear, they all have their hit cap, everyone's fully ready, fully enchanted, consumables and everything, and people just absolutely stomp it in basically like 30 seconds. But back then, raid groups kind of looked like this sometimes, where they'd be all running around with just basic stat gear in their dungeon set. We had no idea what we were doing back then, and the damage suffered because of it. So certain raid guilds that really struggled with outputting enough damage would just never be able to get through this wall. They would never have enough to finish it off, and at one point maybe their tank would get the bomb or whatever it would be, some healers, and they would eventually wipe. And like I said, from a personal experience, I've stated this before in a couple previous videos, I was in a guild called Blade Runners, and we struggled on this boss for maybe like 4 to 6 months. It was absolutely insane. We were kind of like the laughing stock of the endgame community. There were guilds that were worse than us, but we were kind of like that mid-tier guild, and we just got stuck here on Vaelstrasz for months. I think Blade Runners only cleared Blackwing Lair pretty much towards the naxx patch. So while guilds like Fury and the Transcendent on my server were blasting through naxx, we were still struggling with Vaelstrasz. Okay, so now we're gonna jump over to AQ40 with another boss who's honestly quite similar to Vaelstrasz in the way that it plays out. This next stonewall of a boss was Princess Huhuran, one of the later or mid-later bosses within AQ40. So Huhuran again doesn't have super complex mechanics. There's like a wyvern sting type thing that puts people to sleep. There's a mechanic with the melee that makes them take damage. There's a poison volley that hits the entire raid, and once you get her low, she gets enraged and just hits super freaking hard. For the most part, pretty simple. You need nature resist to deal with all the nature damage, a lot of raid healing, and by far the most important thing, similar to vaelstrasz, is really strong DPS. It's not a boss fight that can last super long. You will not be able to sustain through it, especially once she gets enraged. So the whole thing is, you have to kill her really fast. It's a DPS check. And what makes it more difficult in that regard is that you're using nature resist gear, so you're not in your full damage or healing set. Princess Huhuran was absolutely infamous back then. She was known as one of the hardest raid bosses before naxx released. For a lot of the top guilds, it was really simple. They had such good gear, such great off pieces that even with the nature resist set, it was pretty much no problem to just blast right through her. But for mediocre guilds and lower, she was so freaking difficult. You just didn't have enough raid damage to get through it, and eventually she would just clobber your main tank and all of your healers would be This fight specifically was easier on Horde side because shamans have poison cleansing totem, but on Alliance side, it was kind of a pain in the ass for a lot of mid-level guilds. So these two bosses, vaelstrasz and Huhuran, were just DPS checks that guilds really struggled with for months. Okay, so those two bosses were DPS checks. Now this next one is a coordination check, which was something the player base was not super used to until pretty much this boss encounter. We've got the twin emps, the twin emperors, which is the second to last boss if you don't count Uro in AQ40. Now this is another one. I'm sure so many of you guys have vivid memories of being stuck on these guys for months, where the other bosses that we spoke about stonewalled and broke up guilds that were more mediocre and lesser. The Twin Emperors decimated guilds that were pretty much at the top tier a lot of the times. Not world first contenders, but guilds right below that. I remember my brother's guild back on Medivh struggling with this so bad, and they were one of the best guilds on the server. So the Twin Emperors have a ton of mechanics. There's two bosses that you have to deal with to begin with, and you need 2 warlock tanks and 2 warrior tanks on each side, and tanking these bosses way spread apart from each other. Every now and then, the twin emps will switch places. They'll just teleport and each of them will switch. Once they do, they drop aggro. If it's the range guy, the warlock needs to pick up aggro and basically warlock tank it using Searing Pain. If it's the melee one, then the warrior has to pick it up. So right there, you're constantly swapping and the tanks have to immediately pick it up and stabilize. If they don't and the twin emps get too close to each other from chasing on heal aggro or something, then once they get too close, they start healing each other up. Now that's just the base mechanic that you have to deal with, and it's quite a delicate balance between those 4 tanks. But on top of that, you're dealing with bugs all over the place that are either enraging or exploding. You're dealing with blizzards, and the caster boss that the warlock is tanking casts an AoE blast. So every single time right before they swap, the melee needs to peel off and switch on back onto the melee one. So they're constantly running back and forth. You're dealing with a bunch of different mechanics, coordinating tanks and coordinating melee throughout the entire encounter, and it's a pretty long one. One screw up and it's pretty much over. This is one of the most awesome raid encounters that there is in vanilla, and you should be definitely looking forward to it because progressing these guys is probably one of the most fun I've ever had in Classic WoW. So get ready for the Twin Emps. They're monsters. Okay, so that's the second, or I guess third to last boss in AQ40. But there's another one, or at least within its first release state, was probably the most difficult, in fact impossible boss ever released in the entire game. We've got Cthun. And a lot of you guys know that when Cthun was first released to the player base, it was actually 100% unfeasible. It was literally impossible. You needed a 60-man raid worth of DPS to get through it, even if you were the best geared. But even after it was nerfed by the WoW devs, it was still one of the hardest bosses in the entire game. Maybe not for the top tier guilds that had been progressing it for the last few months and had the strategy down packed entirely, but for guilds that were lagging behind and just getting into it for the first time, it's still a wall. Cthun, even to this day, I'd say is one of the most intense fights when it comes to raid team coordination, especially since you're doing every single phase with 40 people. The first phase is absolutely delicate. You need to split up your raid around the circular room in perfect coordination. Group 1 here, Group 2 here, Group 3 here, and all the way around the entire circumference of the room. Not only that, but they all need to spread out, I think about 10 yards away from each other. If they're too close, there's gonna be a chain lightning effect from the boss, and it's gonna tether from person to person to person and pretty much destroy them all. Now that's pretty simple, right? Just basically spread out and have all the groups around the circle. But it doesn't end there. During that phase, Cthun casts this ability called Dark Glare, where he casts a laser beam in a line and it shifts around the entire circle of the room. The entire raid needs to run around the circle avoiding that beam. But once the Dark Glare is finished, they need to replace themselves in their perfect position group by group by group, but shifted in an entirely different portion of the room. The spatial awareness is really difficult to handle, especially since you're coordinating that spatial awareness between 40 different people. All this while tentacles and eyeballs and all kinds of things are spawning all over the place. But that's only the first phase. Then you get to the second phase, which is similar with eyeballs and tentacles all over the place, except people are getting sucked into the stomach of Cthun, and then they have to kill his tentacle, start his weakened phase, and then damage him throughout that weakened phase, and rinse and repeat over and over again. I'd say that the first phase is really the difficult one, but it's just a super long and grueling raid encounter that requires crazy coordination between all 40 people. You guys are gonna see, right now we have guilds in Ragnaros' lair where they're just sort of standing and they blast them through and it's almost like a DPS race. But once Cthun comes and you're gonna see fresh guilds who have never experienced Classic before, have never done Cthun, progressing on this guy, it's gonna be seriously difficult. Alright, now this next one you might not have known was as difficult as it is. So if you remember back in naxx during early progress, most raid guilds wouldn't complete entire wings. You've probably heard that a lot of raid guilds back then had only killed maybe 4 or 5 bosses, but it wasn't like they would go into the construct quarter and just clear the entire thing and they only had construct quarter down. What they would do is maybe they'd kill Patchwork, they'd kill Instructor Vesuvius, they'd kill Noth, Anubarak, and maybe Grand Widow Fairlina. This is because some of the second or third bosses within specific wings were unholy difficult. Now people know Instructor Vesuvius as one of the easiest first bosses to kill in Naxxramas, but there's a reason why people kill Instructor Vesuvius and then don't continue in the Deathwing quarter. That's because the next boss is a powerhouse. We've got Gothic the Harvester. This is that raid room, you've probably seen it before, especially if you played back in Wrath of the Lich King. It's pretty iconic, I'd say, where there's a gate that separates the room and there's basically 2 sides of the room. There's an undead side and a Death Knight side with 3 bone piles on each. These 3 bone piles are constantly spawning adds that are rushing towards the center. For the most part, you're thinking, okay, we've got adds that are spawning on each side, let's deal with them as they come out and then kill the boss. Nothing too difficult. But they come out at a crazy pace and it's so hard to deal with them. You don't have the DPS to finish them as they're coming out, and they all have unique abilities. What makes it so difficult is you have to coordinate so many different shackles. In order to do this fight, you need way more priests. You can't just go in with 4 priests if that's what you're bringing usually. And as the ghosts and death knights are spawning on each side, every single priest has to make sure that he's shackling a different target. You can't overlap 2 shackles on 1 target. There needs to be perfect control and perfect coordination between the priest shackles, the tanks that are picking up their mobs, and the DPS that are focusing the right mobs and stunning the right mobs that they need to stun. It can very easily become an absolute cluster, requiring a crazy amount of DPS to upkeep with the ad spawns, a great amount of coordination between all of the priests shackling the right targets, and of course the tanks who are picking up and controlling everything to the best of their abilities. Gothic was one of the most difficult fights back then, and it's one of the fights in Naxxramas that my guild personally, when I went back to it a couple years ago, we had the most trouble with. We went in honestly thinking it's going to be pretty easy, and it took us weeks to actually get through it. So trust me, get ready for Gothic, it's a doozy. Okay, so last boss on the list, and I covered this one in my most unique raid encounters, as well as a couple other ones on this list, but this is obviously expected and one of the hardest boss fights I've ever experienced in the entire game. And similar to what I said with the twin emps and whatnot in AQ40, this specific raid encounter did not only break up mediocre guilds, but imposed a monumental challenge to some of the best raiding guilds in the entire world back then. We've got, you guessed it, the Four Horsemen. If you go look at kill videos for this boss specifically, the one thing that you're going to notice first is probably that the raid encounter itself takes about 18, I guess, for the best guilds and the best gear that can do it fast, to like 23 minutes to actually complete the encounter. So you've got 20 plus minutes of absolute perfect coordination to execute on. One mistake and it's over, like most raid encounters in vanilla. What makes this so difficult is that you're dealing with a council of horsemen. There's 4 of them, and each one needs to be tanked way far away in a corner, so all 4 corners within the boss room. But you're not just splitting up 4 groups and having one healer heal the tank here, one healer heal the tank there, and basically for every single corner having a different group. The groups are constantly shifting. There's a debuff that gets applied that stacks up in the radius of each boss. So you're constantly shifting tanks and shifting healers and shifting DPS from boss to boss to boss in a coordinated manner. And yes, shifting tanks. This means you need 8 tanks for this encounter, and some of them need fire resist to deal with the meteor. So you'll have a tank on one boss, and then he'll take up a certain amount of marks, and then another tank is gonna have to come in, taunt the boss off of him, he'll go back to the safe zone, and then maybe swap to another one, and it's the healers are swapping, going from spot to spot to spot, healing each different tank when they're swapping with another healer, going back and forth. The DPS is getting marks and then going to the next one. It's absolutely crazy. You have the safe zone, and then you have the 4 bosses, and you're just coordinating the raid in a tactical, conscious manner and swapping people in and out and in and out and in and out throughout the entire encounter. I've healed this encounter and I've DPS'd this encounter, and it is absolutely crazy. I say this all the time, but this is the best raid encounter I've ever experienced from vanilla to Wrath of the Lich King, because to be honest, I didn't really raid much past there. If any raid boss on this list can break a guild come Classic 2019 or 2020, probably by then, it's gonna be the Four Horsemen, and we're gonna see guilds that are going to be bashing their skulls into this boss for a long time. Maybe not months, but trust me, a long time. And I don't even think the brief description that I gave it right here does it justice. Maybe go watch a boss kill video for the Four Horsemen and you'll really understand exactly what I'm talking about. And look forward to progressing this with your guild, because it's going to bring you guys all together and you'll walk out after killing it as best friends. Alright guys, now with the classic experience that we have here in 2019, I doubt we'll see the same kind of stonewalling on raid bosses like we did back then. You know, I doubt we'll see guilds stuck on vaelstrasz for months on end with how well people are itemized nowadays alone. So fear not, history should not repeat itself on this one. Although I don't necessarily think that raid encounters that are so difficult for the player base that cause them to get stonewalled for so long are a bad thing for the game at all. I feel like they add a lot to the notoriety and the infamous nature of the experience in general. People always talk and reminisce about how it took months before anyone killed Kel'Thas in Tempest Keep, for example, in the Burning Crusade back then. It's kind of awesome, if anything. So things might seem overtly easy right now, guys, but trust me, there's some hefty challenges that await you in the next couple patches. Raid content will get real interesting real soon. So hopefully you guys enjoy this one. I hope it brought back some nostalgic memories from raiding back then. If you like my content and want to see more like it, make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, of course, you know the drill, soldiers. Hit the notification bell to be notified every single time I post a new video straight out of the render oven. And with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.